So, Professor Wilkins, when did you first become aware of and interested in visual stress?
Well, it goes back a very long way. I was working in Montreal as a postdoc, looking at the effects of brain operations on people for the relief of epilepsy. And I was asked to see a patient who was then 14, and she had seizures whenever she looked at striped lines. And that struck me as very, very odd. And we were able to treat her strangely with a pair of glasses with a frosted lens. It's a terribly invasive treatment, but in her case, there was nothing else available. The seizures were minor seizures. She just lost awareness for a few seconds. So I was able to investigate what it was that provoked them, what type of visual stimuli she was sensitive to, and that eventually got published. But the fact that we'd been able to reduce her seizures meant I wanted to carry on with that work when I came back to England to work at the MRC Applied Psychology Unit, as it was then. And Alan Badley, the director, allowed me to carry on working on photosensitive epilepsy, which I did for about 20 years. And then one day I asked people on the subject panel, we had a panel of people who came in to do our experiments, and I asked them to look at the sort of images that I knew would invoke seizures, and I was surprised, actually, that a lot of people complained of eye strain and headache, and I thought, well, I better not do that again. And that got me interested in headache and migraine and eventually in visual stress. So that's how it came about. It's a very long, slow progress. Yeah.
How did you identify the need for a device like the colorimeter?
Well, there had been reports in the media of the work of Helen Erlin in helping some people to read. And I was intrigued by this because I knew that colored glasses could help some patients with light sensitive epilepsy. Not always the same color. So I was intrigued, and I needed some way. I wanted to see these patients and talk to them and learn their history and so on. And I needed a device to help them find a color they thought was best. And I originally built a simple device using a red, green, and blue lamp and three rheostats, but that didn't work because, as you probably know, when you add red and green light together, you get yellow. It's totally counterintuitive. So I was looking at the wall in my kitchen, which has got a spotlight on it. And I thought, well, if we divided that spotlight into a red, green, and blue, and then we put the light not on the center, but eccentrically, we could vary the hue and saturation separately. And that's what I needed. And I built that device in my garage and subsequently out of wood. And, the first one nearly caught fire. But I found that one could reduce the heat of the lamp because in those days we didn't have LEDs. The heat of the lamp with a little aquarium.
Great.
and anyway, I built this device and was able to demonstrate that some people definitely were consistent about the color they chose, different in each case. So that's how it came about. Of course, we use a different method of color mixing now, which has the advantage that it gives the same spectral power distribution as you get with the lenses. But it was that first instrument that showed me how different people were. Um, and things moved on from there, really.
How does the current version of the intuitive colorimeter work then?
It works in a very different way from previous models. There have been three basic changes to the design. The first design used the method of color mixing that I mentioned earlier with the spotlight and the three colors, but subsequent methods used fluorescent lamps and a series of 7 differently colored dyes in a cylinder, so you could slide the cylinder along and rotate it. Rotating it changed the hue, and sliding it out of the beam changed the into and introducing a grey filter changed the saturation. Nowadays, it's done using LEDs, and instead of rotating a cylinder, we change the number of LEDs lit behind each of the bank of filters. There are 2 filters for the color, and then there's a bank of filters for gray to vary saturation. And the color mixing is done electronically. The advantage of LEDs is that most lighting is now LED, and one wants a colorimeter that has the same or similar spectral power to what you get with conventional artificial lighting. And so that's a merit. And they have the great advantage that they don't produce any heat. So you haven't got to worry about that, and you can control them easily electronically. So that's the new system. Just you operate it with a laptop, I should say a tablet, and it seems to work reasonably well. People are reasonably happy with it. It was fun to help build, but it was a team effort.
Looking back, what do you see as the most significant landmarks or breakthroughs in developing the instruments that we use and practice today?
Breakthroughs. Ooh. In using instruments, I think the biggest one was the change from a method of color mixing that used 3 filters to a method of color mixing that used 7, and used the 7 dyes that he used for tinting spectacle lenses, so that the spectral power within the colorimeter is the same or very similar to that which you get when you wear lenses. And that's important because it means that people with anomalous color vision can be tested, and that doesn't interfere with their use of the instrument at all.
What
So,
would you consider the most significant impact of the colorimeter on individuals struggling with visual stress symptoms?
well, with any luck, it removes the symptoms. Well, it helps a bit. I think that's the main thing. I don't know why. I wish I did. I wish I did. But yeah, no, it's the best we have is kind of a vague idea about changing the distribution of excitation within the visual cortex, but that may or may not be right. I suspect it probably is, but that's insufficiently detailed and very difficult to test. And really, until we have some objective measure that correlates with the color chosen, we won't get very far. But I think we're beginning to get such a measure now. I'm very pleased to report it looks as though the size of the hemodynamic response in the brain, the oxygenation of the brain, seems to correlate quite strongly with visual stress. And we can measure that objectively now, very simply. So it won't be long before we have an objective correlate of the color chosen, which will be a huge step forward.
Could you share any particular cases that stand out and have stayed with you over the years?
Yes, there's one that stands out. She was a girl who was completely non-verbal. She came with her parents. She was, severely epileptic, and she sat down in the chair, looked in the colorimeter, and took her head out. And I thought, well, I don't know what to do here. So, but anyway, we persevered. And when we came to a particular blue, she just put her head in the instrument. And her mum said, oh, she liked that one. And so I made up some spectacles in that colour, which substantially reduced her seizures. There was no question about it. She'd had no change in medication for 2 previous years. We knew the seizure incidents, and suddenly they almost completely abated. So my mother said it was the only thing that made any difference. She was a very severe um, child, very severely affected. So that one stands out.
So looking back on your work, which I believe includes over 200 papers and 4 books, do any discoveries about visual stress stand out as particularly significant? Maybe when after a lot of frustration, you had that sort of eureka moment.
Well, eureka is rather a strong word. But, um, yes, I think when I got complaints from normal observers, healthy observers, when they looked at um, stimuli that I knew were epileptogenic, that was very early on. And and that provoked me to study what it was. And I found the ones who were headache prone were more susceptible, and that led on. Um, Second one was the spotlight I've already mentioned in my kitchen, which allowed me to build a very simple optical device that allowed you to change the hue and saturation separately without changing luminance. That was a key feature. And thirdly is the pattern that's behind me. That is a work of art by Debbie Ailes. And she's an artist who used her migraine as an inspiration for her work and got a prize for this painting that's up behind me. It's in a room in the house that my wife doesn't use because she can't stand looking at it. And Debbie came to see me because people didn't like her art. And that led to a Fourier analysis of the artwork, showing that it wasn't just the color differences, although they're very important. It was the shapes, how very unlike the ones you get in nature they are. And that led on to models of visual discomfort that we now have, computerized models. But it began with Debbie Ailes's painting. It's a painting of a barn.
So we've seen in practice a huge impact that colorimetry can have on someone that's struggling with light or flicker or pattern sensitivity. What areas of advancement and research do you think are needed next?
Well, we're getting somewhere with brain imaging. Um, the things that are uncomfortable to look at evoke very large changes in the oxygenation of the brain, and those are very important. And they provide a clue, really, as to why we get the pain and why we get the disturbance. And we've got an objective correlate at last of the discomfort people experience. And that's very important. It's interesting that the brain activity, the brain oxygenation increases the greater the difference between what you're looking at and what you see in nature. Now, that's very interesting because, of course, we've built an environment that is very different from nature. It has highly periodic elements, an awful lot of flicker, and very strong colours, none of which are particularly good for the visual system. So I think the most important thing going forward is to get rid of the flicker that you can't see that occurs in many LED lighting installations. I think it's unconscionable, I think is the word, that the lighting industry has imposed this new form of lighting without consideration of the effects of flicker. We already know since 1989 that flicker from fluorescent lighting causes headache in a minority, an eye strain, and the flicker that some LED installations now provide is even greater. There isn't a change in color, but there's still a change in brightness, which almost certainly causes headache. Of course, we need to demonstrate that without doubt. But since it's almost trivial to remove, I think we should do so forthwith. I think the current limitations that are being introduced rather belatedly are probably insufficient. The thing we've discovered about LED lighting is that every time you make a rapid eye movement, a saccade, you can resolve the flicker. The flash of the flicker gets pasted in a different position on the back of the eye, and you see it as a pattern, or can do. You'll probably notice that in the rear lights of cars when you're driving at night. And that probably disturbs eye movement control, and it's quite unnecessary. It's quite possible, without extra cost, really, to introduce electronic drivers that do not flicker. Flicker is used widely in computer screens to vary the brightness. It shouldn't be. Alternative ways of varying the brightness need to be found. It's a bit of imagination on the part of engineers rather than flickering. Pulse width modulation, it's called. You flicker the lamp and you vary the proportion of time that it's turned on. And because the devices, such as LEDs, are very fast, you can do so and it appears as a change in brightness, which is all very simple, but actually deleterious to health. And it's time it was got rid of. I feel very strongly about that, having talked to people. And it's quite evident that flicker has detrimental effects on not health, but social well-being. I've come across patients who won't go into supermarkets, and the reason is they're sensitive to the flicker from the fluorescent lighting. And if you use your smartphone and put it on slow-mo video, and take a video as you go shopping, and you'll find about half the shops in the high street have flickering lighting. No reason at all. Half don't. It's time we wised up to this and got rid of the flicker and made lighting more natural. After all, you don't get flicker in nature except when sunlight's interrupted by roadside trees or on the surface, reflected from waves on the surface of water. So flicker is bad for you, even at very high frequencies when you can't see it. So that aspect of our environment needs to change.
So we know that LEDs can be a significant problem, and FL41 lens has come to people's attention more recently. Have you got anything to say about how that might help people with migraine or not?
And the FL41 lens I developed back in 1989 when I discovered that fluorescent lighting was a problem. And in those days, the lamps varied continuously, 100 times a second, from bright white to dim orange. So I thought if we give them an orange lens, it'll reduce the amount of variation. And so we created this lens, and it was trialed in children who had headaches, and it seemed to work better than a blue lens. And that trial is still quoted, even though the children were then exposed to fluorescent lighting that no longer exists, because they've changed the phosphors on the lighting, and it now goes bright white to dim green most of the time. So those lamps, they're completely different, and the f141 lens won't reduce the flicker. However, it was discovered in the States, I don't know how serendipitously, that f141 seemed to reduce blepharospasm, which is interesting. I saw a patient once who had blepharospasm, and at the time I had a lab where we had fluorescent lighting could either flicker 100 times a second, as was conventional, or light the same lamps controlled from different circuitry so that they flickered 20 or 30,000 times a second, so there was no flicker. And she sat in the lab under the high frequency lamp and no problems at all. And then I turned over to the low frequency lighting, and lo and behold, her blepharospasm started. So I switched back rapidly to the high frequency steady light, and but it made her, she carried on with her spasm, sadly. So it takes time to abate. But so something about flicker may be responsible for aspects of blepharospasm. This is just a happenstance observation. I don't really know. No one's investigated, but when you're under strain, you're more likely to have a blepharospasm. I have it myself. Hemifacial spasm anyway. And so currently, I don't think FL41 is going to help, but that doesn't mean that color as such will help. It probably does mean it'll help to some extent, because everybody's different. And what we now know is that the color they select as comfortable works far better than these off-the-shelf colors that are being widely advertised. Yeah, people are very different optometrically and neurologically. And we now know that people who are neurodivergent are very sensitive to sensory stimulation. And we need to take that into account. But there are very large individual differences. And these are also reflected in the color people choose. There are weak statistical relationships between the color people choose and the neurological diagnosis they have. Not useful clinically, but sufficient to demonstrate that there's a neurological substrate to the color they choose. But we need to explore that in relation to the hemodynamic response and so forth, which we will, given time.
Do we understand why neurodivergent individuals are more light sensitive and more likely to have visual stress and more likely to benefit from precision tinted lenses?
We know that they are more visually sensitive, and that sensitivity extends across other modalities. So if you're visually sensitive, you can also be sensitive in the auditory sense as well. Why is a difficult question. In the case of migraine, then we know that in migraine, the visual cortex is hyper excitable. You can show a larger fMRI old response, a blood oxygenation level dependent response. And I suspect that's also the case in many neurodivergent individuals. And there's also a comorbidity with epilepsy in most of these neurodivergent cases. It's not a strong one, not enough to worry about, but enough to make you suppose that maybe the cortex is more likely to, neural discharge is more likely to spread slightly. and that would give you perceptual distortion and might then give you discomfort. That's a theoretical angle for which there is currently not a lot of evidence, but I was reading a paper the other day that suggests that there is one unitary condition of light sensitivity that exists across a plethora of different neurological conditions and is similar across those conditions, which is very interesting. So I think there's an increasing interest in neurodivergence and sensory sensitivity that goes with it. And I think the number of people working in that area is now such that we're going to make some substantial advances fairly soon. I hope so.
Would you have anything to say to someone looking at the effects of lenses prescribed from the intuitive colorimeter and they're just unsure because it seems too good to be true, the benefits that they can bring?
Well, the benefits occur in some people, not in everybody. That's the first thing. Beware adverts. That's another thing. Go for treatments that have been trialed, and this is one of them. There's an awful lot of stuff on the web which you can dismiss, frankly, and particularly a huge range of glasses for migraine treatment. They're trying to sell one size fits all, and it doesn't. It doesn't. People are very different. And what colorimetry offers is a service that allows people to choose a color that is helpful, if there is one, and allows you to see if there is a color that's helpful, and then to provide it in colored lenses. And that is a unique treatment, and it's one that has been trialed, not extensively, and it needs further trials, but there is reasonable evidence now that's accumulated over the years to support its use. So I would say it's worth a trial. Give it a go.